When notorious UK crime lord Dominic the Hammer Reid crossed paths with ruthless Albanian Mafia kingpin Arben Krasniqi, Liverpool became a battlefield, an entire city caught in the crossfire of a war no one saw coming. Liverpool was a city of contrasts. On the surface, it was alive with music, football, and bustling streets lined with historic buildings. Tourists wandered through the docks, snapping pictures of the famous waterfront, while locals went about their daily lives, unaware of the storm brewing beneath the city's vibrant exterior. For years, the criminal underworld in Liverpool had remained relatively stable, dominated by the UK's most notorious crime lords. These men controlled the drug trade, gambling rings, and protection rackets with an iron fist. Their operations were well-oiled machines, and they had long-established networks that extended from the city's docks to the surrounding neighborhoods. Fear and respect were their weapons, and the city's underworld knew not to cross them. But beneath this facade of order, tensions had begun to simmer. Rumors of a new group moving into the city started circulating among local criminals. Whispers spoke of Albanians arriving in Liverpool, men with reputations that preceded them, ruthless, precise, and utterly unafraid of violence. They were known across Europe for their efficiency in taking over criminal enterprises and eliminating anyone who stood in their way. Unlike the UK gangs, who relied on intimidation and a network of allies, the Albanians were disciplined, organized, and methodical in their approach. They did not negotiate or bluff. They executed. The first signs of their presence were subtle but unmistakable. Warehouse leases suddenly changed hands, and a string of smaller drug operations were quietly absorbed into unfamiliar hands. Local police noticed a spike in suspicious activity, but by the time they pieced together the pattern, the Albanians had already entrenched themselves in the city. Their arrival went largely unnoticed by the public, masked by Liverpool's busy streets and the normal chaos of city life. For the UK crime lords, this new presence was alarming. Their power had gone largely uncontested for years, and the idea of outsiders challenging their dominance sparked fear and anger. Meetings were held in secret locations, plans were discussed, and alliances were reconsidered. They had faced rival gangs before, but nothing like this. The Albanians did not behave like other criminals. They were strategic, patient, and utterly lethal. Their reputation for swift retaliation sent a clear message. Anyone who resisted would face consequences far beyond what the UK lords had ever seen. Residents of the city began to feel the tension, even if they did not understand its source. Reports of unexplained violence, abandoned vehicles near the docks, and sudden police raids created an atmosphere of unease. Families walked with caution after dark, and local businesses began to install extra security. Liverpool, a city known for its resilience and lively spirit, began to sense the first tremors of an impending war. Unbeknownst to the public, the Albanians were not here for small-time operations. They had their sights set on control. The UK crime lords, confident in their established networks, underestimated the determination and resources of the newcomers. Liverpool was about to be drawn into a conflict that would shake its streets, shatter lives, and leave an indelible mark on the city's history. The stage was set for a clash that no one in Liverpool could have fully prepared for, and the calm before the storm was a deceptive veil over the chaos that was about to erupt. The arrival of the Albanian Mafia in Liverpool was swift and deliberate. They didn't make flashy entrances or draw attention to themselves at first. Instead, they moved quietly, calculating every step with precision. Their first targets were the city's outskirts, small-time drug dealers and minor criminal enterprises that had long operated independently. These early moves seemed minor, almost incidental, but they were anything but. Each acquisition strengthened the Albanians' foothold in Liverpool and sent a clear warning to anyone who dared challenge them. Local criminals began noticing that warehouses once bustling with activity were suddenly under new management, controlled by men who did not speak much, but whose actions spoke volumes. The Albanians' methods were chilling in their efficiency. They relied on intimidation, but it was a measured intimidation that left no doubt about their intentions. Businesses that resisted their overtures were vandalized, shipments went missing, and sometimes bodies were found in abandoned areas of the city, a grim reminder of the consequences of defiance. Unlike local gangs, who often relied on reputation and loyalty, the Albanians seemed to operate with a cold, strategic logic. They didn't need to terrorize the entire city. They only needed to make an example of a few to ensure compliance. It wasn't long before whispers of their presence reached the ears of Liverpool as established crime lords. These men had grown accustomed to controlling the city's underworld, and they were confident in their ability to manage rivals. Yet, the Albanians were unlike anyone they had faced before. They were organized, disciplined, and unafraid to act decisively. The UK lords, who had long thrived on fear and alliances, now faced a challenge that could not be met with old strategies alone. Every decision carried risk, and even minor mistakes could invite retaliation. As the Albanians expanded, they began recruiting local talent, drawing individuals who were disillusioned with the existing power structure or seeking protection under a new, more ruthless regime. This recruitment created divisions within the city's criminal networks, weakening the UK lords' influence and fueling suspicion and paranoia among their ranks. Friends became enemies overnight, and loyalties were constantly tested. The Albanians didn't just fight with violence. They fought with manipulation, infiltration, and careful planning. Liverpool's streets began to feel different. There was an unspoken tension in neighborhoods that had once been lively and familiar. Drivers hurried past unfamiliar faces near the docks, and shopkeepers discreetly locked doors earlier in the evening. Ordinary citizens may not have known the details, but they sensed the shift. Something dangerous was moving through the city, and it was unstoppable. The Albanians were not here for short-term gains. They were here to dominate, to rewrite the rules of the criminal world in Liverpool. For the UK crime lords, every day without action was a loss. They attempted to send warnings, arrange meetings, and assert control over disputed areas, but the Albanians' response was always precise and calculated. Liverpool had become a chessboard, and the Albanians seemed several moves ahead. It was clear their confrontation was inevitable, and the city itself had unknowingly become the stage for a battle that would test the limits of fear, power, and survival. The coming weeks promised a conflict that would shake Liverpool to its very core. The first clash between the UK crime lords and the Albanian Mafia erupted like a storm in a quiet part of Liverpool. It started with a shipment that was supposed to be delivered to one of the UK lords' trusted warehouses. The cargo, carefully guarded and highly valuable, never reached its destination. Instead, it disappeared without a trace. At first, the loss seemed like a simple mistake or theft, but the evidence quickly suggested otherwise. The Albanians had executed the operation with precision, leaving no fingerprints, no witnesses, and no room for negotiation. When the UK lords discovered what had happened, anger and disbelief spread through their ranks. They were used to controlling the flow of goods and maintaining strict oversight over their territory, and the idea that a foreign mafia could disrupt their operations so completely was unacceptable. They immediately sought retaliation, sending men to investigate, intimidate, and if necessary, eliminate the intruders. But by the time they arrived, the Albanians had already vanished, leaving behind only silent warehouses and a chilling message. Liverpool was no longer under their complete control. The first bodies appeared days later, abandoned in old, deserted warehouses. They were not just warnings, they were a statement of power. The victims were clearly connected to the UK lords, and the way they were left displayed a cold and calculated brutality. News of the killings spread quickly through the city's underworld. The UK crime lords, who had once ruled with near-total authority, realized for the first time that they were facing an opponent they could not easily intimidate. Fear began to seep into their ranks, replacing the usual confidence and arrogance that had long defined them. The Albanian Mafia did not stop with one strike. Small, coordinated attacks began appearing across the city. Shipments went missing, businesses associated with UK gangs were vandalized, and men who had been considered untouchable suddenly found themselves at risk. The Albanians were testing the limits of their new territory, identifying weaknesses and exposing cracks in the UK lord's power. Every move was deliberate, each act of violence a calculated step toward domination. Liverpool's residents, still largely unaware of the details, began to feel the tension in the air. The docks, once a hub of commerce and activity, grew quieter as workers and sailors became cautious. Streets normally filled with laughter and chatter became shadowed and tense. Local business owners started installing extra locks, and families avoided going out at night. The city had transformed, almost overnight, into a place where danger could appear without warning, and where the ordinary rhythms of life were overshadowed by the threat of violence. Within the criminal world, paranoia spread like wildfire. Friends suspected each other of collusion, and minor disagreements escalated into deadly confrontations. The UK crime lords struggled to maintain cohesion, while the Albanians continued to move with an almost supernatural efficiency. They struck where least expected, disappeared without a trace, and forced their enemies into a reactive state. Liverpool, a city that had once seemed invincible to the reach of organized crime, was now on the verge of being consumed by it. This first clash marked a turning point. It was no longer a question of who controlled the docks or the streets. It had become a battle for survival. Both sides understood that the next move could determine the fate of the city. Liverpool had crossed a threshold, and there was no going back. The war had begun, and its impact would ripple through every corner of the city, altering lives and reshaping the balance of power forever. As the weeks passed, the conflict between the UK crime lords and the Albanian Mafia escalated beyond anything Liverpool had ever experienced. What had started as targeted strikes and thefts soon grew into open, violent confrontations across the city. Explosions tore through quiet warehouses, setting fire to entire blocks near the docks. Armored vehicles belonging to gang members were torched in broad daylight, their charred remains left as grim warnings to anyone who might resist. The Albanians had proven they were not merely intruders, they were conquerors with a plan to dominate the city at any cost. The UK crime lords, accustomed to controlling Liverpool with intimidation and careful alliances, found themselves constantly on the defensive. Every territory they claimed was challenged, every shipment at risk, and every move scrutinized. They retaliated, of course, striking back at Albanian operations whenever possible, but their efforts were often met with precise counterattacks. The Albanians seemed to anticipate their every strategy, exploiting weaknesses and turning even small skirmishes into deadly encounters. The streets became a maze of suspicion, with drivers and pedestrians wary of unseen threats at every corner. Ordinary citizens, previously unaware of the depth of the criminal world in their city, began to feel the effects of the escalating violence. Innocent bystanders were caught in the crossfire, businesses shut down early, and families barricaded themselves inside homes after sunset. The once vibrant nightlife of Liverpool grew eerily silent, as if the city itself were holding its breath. Local media reported explosions, shootings, and mysterious disappearances, but the full extent of the conflict was often shrouded in secrecy. Fear became a constant presence, permeating every neighborhood and creating a sense of urgency that the authorities struggled to contain. The Albanians' approach to violence was strategic rather than chaotic. They struck where it would inflict the most damage, targeting key figures and infrastructure essential to the UK lords' operations. Their attacks were quick, methodical, and designed to send a message. Liverpool belonged to those who were willing to fight and survive with ruthless efficiency. The UK crime lords responded in kind, attempting to regain control through force and intimidation. Yet each retaliation only seemed to provoke the Albanians further. resulting in a spiraling cycle of violence that neither side could fully control. In this climate of fear and uncertainty, trust became a rare commodity. Allies of the UK lords began questioning each other's loyalty, while the Albanians exploited internal divisions to strengthen their position. The city's criminal ecosystem, once predictable and hierarchical, was now fragmented and volatile. Every confrontation carried the risk of mass casualties, and both sides knew that mistakes could be fatal. Liverpool had transformed from a city known for football, music, and culture into a battlefield where survival depended on constant vigilance and ruthless action. Authorities attempted to intervene, launching raids and increasing patrols, but their presence often had limited effect. The war had become too complex, involving networks and alliances that stretched across neighborhoods and criminal enterprises. For the residents, the escalation of violence was not just shocking, it was deeply personal. The sense of normalcy they once took for granted had vanished. Liverpool was no longer just a city. It had become a war zone, and the outcome of the conflict remained uncertain. Every day brought new chaos, and the tension gripping the streets promised that the city's nightmare was far from over. As the conflict between the UK crime lords and the Albanian Mafia intensified, the line between friend and foe began to blur. Trust, once a cornerstone of Liverpool's criminal networks, became nearly impossible to find. Some members of the UK gangs, fearful of the Albania's ruthless efficiency, began secretly aligning themselves with the newcomers. These defections were not always motivated by loyalty or ideology. They were driven by survival, greed, and the instinct to remain on the winning side. The Albanians welcomed these insiders, using them to gain valuable intelligence and strengthen their control over disputed territories. Betrayals came in many forms. Trusted lieutenants disappeared, their operations quietly absorbed by the Albanians. Communication within the UK lords' ranks grew fractured, as paranoia spread like wildfire. Every meeting, every transaction, every casual conversation became a potential trap. Leaders began questioning the loyalty of those closest to them, unsure who might be feeding information to the enemy. In this climate of suspicion, even long-standing alliances crumbled, replaced by temporary pacts and fragile agreements that could shatter at the first hint of disloyalty. The Albanians, ever methodical, exploited these divisions with precision. They understood that fear and uncertainty could be as effective as direct violence. By cultivating insiders within the UK gangs, they were able to orchestrate attacks with surgical accuracy, striking targets at the exact moment their defenses were weakest. Entire operations were compromised without a single gunshot fired, as misinformation and betrayal did their work silently. The UK lords, once confident in their ability to command respect and obedience, found themselves fighting battles on multiple fronts, both in the streets and within their own ranks. The impact on the city was profound. Neighborhoods once controlled by the UK gangs saw sudden shifts in power. Shopkeepers and residents noticed unfamiliar faces patrolling streets, and rumors spread of clandestine meetings between Albanians and former allies of local lords. Ordinary citizens, unaware of the intricate web of betrayals, sensed the instability. Liverpool, already tense from previous clashes, felt even more unpredictable. The streets themselves seemed to mirror the uncertainty within the criminal world, as control shifted from one faction to another overnight. Amid this chaos, some UK gang members tried to resist, clinging to loyalty and the belief that their long-standing power could withstand the challenge. Their resistance was met with brutal consequences. Those who hesitated or acted against the Albanians often disappeared, leaving only fear in their wake. The Albanians' combination of calculated violence and psychological manipulation proved devastatingly effective. By turning allies into enemies and sowing mistrust, they weakened the UK crime lords from within, making open confrontation easier and more dangerous. The war had evolved beyond simple territorial disputes. It had become a game of strategy, manipulation, and survival. No one could be trusted completely, and every action carried immense risk. Liverpool's criminal landscape, once rigid and predictable, was now fluid and chaotic. The city itself seemed to reflect the instability. Streets that had once been familiar now held unseen dangers, and neighborhoods felt like battlegrounds where loyalty was a liability. In this environment, betrayal was no longer just a tactic. It had become a weapon, shaping the course of the conflict and altering the balance of power in ways that no one could have anticipated. The night that would go down in Liverpool's criminal history as the bloodiest arrived without warning. What began as a seemingly ordinary evening quickly descended into chaos. A coordinated attack struck a key stronghold of the UK crime lords, a building that had once been considered impenetrable. Explosions shattered windows and ignited fires that illuminated the city's skyline, sending plumes of smoke across the streets. Gunfire erupted, echoing through the empty alleyways as both sides clashed in a brutal, chaotic confrontation. The Albanians had planned the attack meticulously, striking simultaneously at multiple points to overwhelm their adversaries. By the time the first responders arrived, the scale of destruction was clear. Dozens of bodies lay strewn across the streets and inside the stronghold, victims of carefully executed ambushes and relentless gunfire. The Albanians had demonstrated their lethal efficiency, leaving a trail of carnage that shook even the most hardened criminals. The UK crime lords, though experienced in violence, were caught off guard by the precision and timing of the assault. Their power, once considered absolute within Liverpool, now seemed fragile. Fear gripped their ranks as they realized the Albanians were capable of striking anywhere, anytime, without warning or hesitation. The streets around the attack became scenes of panic. Residents fled their homes, barricading doors and windows as the sound of gunfire continued into the night. Sirens blared as police and emergency services rushed to contain the violence, but the scale of the attack made immediate intervention impossible. Businesses closed, and the city's normally vibrant neighborhoods were transformed into zones of fear and confusion. For the first time, ordinary citizens confronted the reality that Liverpool had become a battleground, where criminal power struggles spilled over into public spaces with deadly consequences. The Albanians did not leave by chance. Their withdrawal was as strategic as the attack itself. They vanished into the shadows, leaving the UK lords to deal with the aftermath and the psychological impact of such a devastating blow. The carnage sent a clear message. Resistance would be met with overwhelming force, and no stronghold was safe from their reach. The bloodiest night in Liverpool's history was a turning point, signaling that the war had escalated beyond territorial disputes and was now a fight for total control. In the following days, the city struggled to recover. The media reported the scale of the violence, fueling public outrage and fear. The UK crime lords convened in secret, attempting to regroup and plan retaliatory strikes, but their confidence had been shattered. Even within their own networks, doubts and paranoia took hold, as members feared further ambushes or betrayals. The Albanians, meanwhile, consolidated their gains, using the fear and chaos to expand their influence and recruit more allies within the city. Liverpool had entered a new, darker chapter. The bloodiest night had proven that no one was untouchable, and the balance of power was shifting rapidly. Streets that were once familiar and safe were now marked by violence and uncertainty, and the city's criminal hierarchy had been irrevocably altered. The war had reached its apex, leaving scars that would linger long after the fires were extinguished and the sirens silenced. Liverpool was no longer just a city. It was a battlefield, and the memory of that night would haunt every corner, shaping the conflicts yet to come. As the violence in Liverpool reached its peak, the city's authorities could no longer ignore the escalating war between the UK crime lords and the Albanian Mafia. Police forces ramped up their operations, deploying additional patrols, surveillance teams, and specialized units to intercept criminal activities. Raids on known gang hideouts became more frequent, and law enforcement worked tirelessly to gather intelligence on the Albania's operations. Yet despite these efforts, the city's criminal networks had become increasingly elusive. Every move by the authorities was met with countermeasures, hidden lookouts, sudden diversions, and carefully orchestrated escapes ensured that few arrests were made. The police soon realized that brute force alone would not be enough. The Albanian Mafia was organized, disciplined, and highly adaptable, often striking in ways that left minimal evidence. They operated in cells, minimizing exposure and communicating through trusted intermediaries. This made it almost impossible to predict their next move. Meanwhile, the UK crime lords, though experienced, were stretched thin, attempting to defend multiple territories while simultaneously managing internal distrust and betrayal. The city had become a web of conflicts, with police interventions often disrupting some operations while inadvertently creating opportunities for others. Behind the scenes, secret negotiations began to take shape. Some factions within both the UK gangs and the Albanian network sought to avoid total destruction, recognizing that continued bloodshed threatened everyone involved. These covert discussions were fraught with tension, conducted in hidden locations with intermediaries acting as messengers. Deals were made in whispers territory exchanges, promises of protection, and agreements to avoid certain streets or neighborhoods. Yet even as these pacts formed, suspicion lingered. Any violation, real or imagined, could reignite violence within hours. The fragile balance was evident across Liverpool. Some areas experienced relative calm as a result of these secret arrangements, giving the appearance of normalcy. Shops reopened, street traffic increased, and residents cautiously resumed daily routines. But the city remained tense, with the knowledge that one misstep could unravel the delicate truce. Neighborhoods that had once been battlefields were now watched closely by both sides, each seeking to maintain control while avoiding open confrontation. The Albanians, ever strategic, used these pauses to strengthen their networks, recruit new allies, and consolidate their position, ensuring they would be ready if hostilities resumed. Even with police pressure and secret deals, the psychological impact on the city was profound. Liverpool's residents had witnessed violence that left scars both physical and emotional. Families moved cautiously, businesses fortified their premises, and the sense of security that once defined the city was gone. For the criminal world, the interventions and negotiations created a new dynamic. Fear and uncertainty replaced straightforward dominance. Leaders had to constantly weigh the risk of action against the potential consequences, knowing that alliances could shift and that even a single miscalculation might lead to disaster. The war had evolved into a complex balance of power, a mix of violence, strategy, and negotiation. While large-scale attacks had slowed, the threat of sudden outbreaks remained. Liverpool's streets were quieter, but the tension was palpable. The Albanians had secured a foothold, the UK crime lords were weakened, and the police were caught in a constant game of catch-up. The city had survived the bloodiest chapters, but its criminal underworld remained unstable, a powder keg waiting for a spark. Liverpool, forever changed by the conflict, existed in a fragile state, where control was never guaranteed and peace was only temporary. Months after the most violent clashes, Liverpool began to breathe again, but the scars left by the gang war were visible everywhere. Streets that had once been familiar now bore the marks of destruction. Burned out buildings, boarded up windows, and abandoned warehouses served as reminders of the chaos that had engulfed the city. Residents who had survived the worst of the violence carried an invisible weight, a constant awareness that the peace around them was fragile and could shatter at any moment. The city's identity had changed. The Liverpool that had been known for football, music, and culture now carried the memory of a war that had turned it into a battlefield. The Albanian Mafia, having proven their strength and ruthlessness, had secured a foothold in Liverpool. They controlled key territories and maintained influence over strategic parts of the criminal network, often through intimidation and strategic alliances with former UK gang members. Their calculated approach meant that their power was consolidated without constant overt violence, though the threat of sudden attacks lingered. The UK crime lords, once unchallenged rulers of the city, had been weakened. Some were eliminated in the fighting, others imprisoned, and a few remained in hiding, plotting revenge, but lacking the resources to regain full control. In the months following the war, the city saw a tense adjustment period. Secret negotiations, previously carried out in whispers and shadows, became the foundation for a new, uneasy order. Certain neighborhoods were effectively divided between the Albanians and surviving UK gangs, with informal agreements determining which areas each side controlled. The Albanians' disciplined organization allowed them to dominate key aspects of Liverpool's criminal economy, including drug distribution, extortion, and smuggling, while UK lords struggled to maintain influence in pockets where they still had loyal followers. The psychological impact on Liverpool's population was profound. Even after the violence subsided, residents remained vigilant. Parents warned children not to wander into certain neighborhoods. Businesses continued to enforce tight security measures, and the city's nightlife remained subdued compared to its former vibrancy. Public trust in authorities was shaken as well. While the police had intervened, the war had demonstrated the limits of official power in the face of highly organized and ruthless criminal networks. Citizens understood that the danger might not be immediate, but it remained ever-present. For those involved in the underworld, the conflict had permanently altered alliances and loyalties. Former allies had become enemies, and old grudges lingered beneath the surface. The Albanian Mafia had proven their dominance not only through violence, but through strategic manipulation, recruitment, and careful consolidation of power. The UK lords who survived the bloodiest nights were left to navigate a new hierarchy where fear, respect, and influence were constantly shifting. Liverpool's war was over, but the city itself had changed irrevocably. The violence had left a permanent mark on its streets, its institutions, and its people. The criminal underworld had adapted to a new order, one in which the Albanians were a central force, and the UK gangs had to accept a reduced role. The lessons of survival, strategy, and ruthlessness would be remembered for years to come, shaping the behavior of criminals and the responses of law enforcement alike. Liverpool had emerged from the chaos, but it was no longer the same city. It had been tested in ways few could have imagined, and the memory of the war served as a constant reminder that the shadow of crime could rise again at any moment, threatening to plunge the city back into darkness.